Have you ever scrolled past a before and after photo and paused for a few seconds because you couldn't believe it was the same person? In today's video, we'll explore 10 famous transgender individuals whose transformations have sparked endless debate, astonishment, and curiosity online. Not just because of their appearance, but because of the stories behind each journey. Behind the glitz, red carpet, and viral moments are years of silent struggle, courageous decisions, and a journey of self-discovery. There are stories that will surprise you, stories that will make you think, and moments that will make you ask yourself, have I truly understood them all? But remember, this isn't just about changing appearance, it's about identity, acceptance, and the courage to live authentically in a world that's always watching. If you enjoy content like this, please subscribe and like to support the channel, and don't miss the next stories. There are people who don't enter fashion in the normal way. They weren't created to fit the mold, they came to break it. And Andreja Pejić is one of those rare cases. Before the name Andreja became iconic, the world knew her by a different image, Andre. But from her very first appearances on the runway, what made people stop wasn't the clothes, but the indescribable feeling she carried. A beauty that didn't lean distinctly towards male or female, not belonging to any familiar definition of the fashion industry. She was like a gap between the molds, and it was that gap that drew the world's attention. But what the public saw was the glamour, while what Andre experienced was a prolonged inner stillness. While celebrated for her uniqueness, she was also placed in a mirror larger than ever before, a mirror where every gaze forced her to answer a question no one else could answer. Who am I in all of this? Success came quickly, but clarity of self didn't keep pace. And it was this disparity that transformed her journey into a prolonged internal dialogue between the image the world held and the true person emerging within. When the gender transition occurred in 2014, it wasn't a change to become a new version of herself, but the moment she stopped trying to maintain an image already defined by the world. For the first time, Andreja no longer existed to conform to the gaze of others, but began to exist for herself. And the most remarkable thing about this story isn't the fame or the dramatic transformation, but the simple yet powerful truth. Sometimes, the bravest thing to do isn't to become an icon, but to dare to step outside of that icon, to be yourself, fully and unconditionally. Some stories don't begin with change, but with a very young person saying something that many adults are still unsure about themselves. Jennings is one such story. While most 6-year-olds are still learning to name the world, Chaz appeared on national television and said something very simple. She was a girl. No beating around the bush, no hesitation. Just a clear affirmation of who she was. That moment quickly spread, not because it was shocking, but because it made people stop and think. How could a child understand herself so clearly? But what makes Chaz's story special is not just her, but also how her family reacted. And instead of turning it into a debate, they chose to turn it into a journey of companionship. They listened, learned, and protected their child in a world that isn't always accepting of differences. From then on, Chaz grew up not in silence, but in sharing. The I Am Chaz program takes viewers into her real life, not just the difficult moments, but also the very ordinary things of a girl growing up. And looking back, what people remember is not the media frenzy, but a very gentle yet very clear message. Sometimes, the most powerful thing is not becoming someone else, but living true to yourself from a very young age. Sometimes a person isn't remembered for how they started, but for daring to take a completely different path from what the world expects. Carmen Carrera is one such case. When she appeared on RuPaul's Drag Race, The first thing that caught people's attention wasn't just her looks or her stage presence, but the feeling that she was born to be in the spotlight. But behind that prominence lies a story that has never been fully told. After the show, instead of continuing to live in the image the public was familiar with, Carmen began a more profound transformation, not to be different in the eyes of others, but to get closer to her true self. It wasn't an easy decision, as each step was accompanied by attention, gossip, and even disapproving glances. But it was precisely in those pressures that Carmen became clearer about her voice. She spoke not only about herself, but also about how society perceived people like her, questions about respect, about naming conventions, and about the right to exist authentically. Gradually, but Carmen was no longer known simply as a television face. She became a representative voice, appearing in fashion and art spaces with the confidence of someone who had undergone significant inner transformation. But looking back on that entire journey, the most important thing wasn't the glamour or the attention, but a very personal choice: to dare to live authentically, even when it made the path ahead far more complicated. When people think of Chaz Bono, they remember not only the son of music icons Sonny Bono and Cher, but also one of the most openly and honestly revealed journeys of self-discovery in the entertainment industry. Born into the spotlight and almost unavoidable attention, Chaz grew up in a world where every step was observed. But behind his seemingly perfect exterior, he lived for years feeling alienated from his own body and identity. It wasn't a fleeting confusion, but a prolonged internal struggle, silent yet persistent, leaving him constantly feeling like he was caught between two versions of himself. His decision to transition at nearly 40 wasn't a sudden turn of events, but the result of decades of reflection, struggle, and self-questioning. That was the moment Chaz stopped running away from the question, "Who am I?" and chose to confront it directly, even if it meant facing public opinion, public curiosity, and inevitable misunderstandings. The journey that followed was not easy. Each change, each adaptation, came with external pressure and a rebuilding of himself internally. But it was in this process that Chaz not only found peace, but also built a new voice, strong, clear, and representative of the LGBTQ+ community. Today, Chaz Bono is not only someone who lives true to himself, but also a symbol of quiet courage. Daring to start over when everyone thinks you've settled. Daring to change when the world has become accustomed to your old version. And perhaps the most profound aspect of his story lies not in the transformation, but in the deeply human message. Sometimes, the hardest journey isn't about going further, but about returning to the true person you've always been. On the internet, sometimes something completely ordinary can become the focus of millions of debates, simply because someone thought it seemed interesting. The story of Lee Norris, the familiar face of Stuart Minkus in Boy Meets World, began that way. Not a scandal, not a shocking statement, just a random comparison of appearance to Chanel West Coast. An idea that initially sounded absurd, but it was precisely that absurdity that made it spread so rapidly. From a single post, the internet quickly added fuel to the fire. Internet users began piecing together photos, scrutinizing details, formulating theories, creating memes, and making analytical videos as if they were solving a real puzzle. Strangely, the less evidence there was, the more the story was discussed, because everyone wants to participate in something that's trending. But when the wave of curiosity subsided, the truth wasn't complicated at all. Lee Norris remains an actor with a stable career, appearing in numerous projects such as Girl Meets World and Gone Girl. Meanwhile, Chanel West Coast continues her own path in music and reality television, notably through Rob Dyrdek's Fantasy Factory. There are no mysterious coincidences, No hidden stories, just two people living two completely different lives. The key isn't the ultimate truth, but how the internet works. When an idea is compelling enough, it can grow faster than logic. And once the crowd joins in, the lines between fun, speculation, and truth begin to blur rapidly. Perhaps this story isn't just a fun online rumor, but also a reminder that in the digital world, not everything that's widely shared is worth believing. Not every story of transformation begins with a single event. Some stories begin at the very peak, where the spotlight, fame, and admiration seem to have reached their peak, and Caitlyn Jenner's journey is one such story. And before the world knew Caitlyn, Bruce Jenner was already an icon of strength and discipline, a gold medalist at the 1976 Olympics representing the human will. But even in the moment the world celebrated his victory, there was a different kind of silence, a part of his true self that had never been properly identified. Outwardly, Bruce was a champion, but inwardly, questions lingered through the years, not loud, not obvious, but enough to remain as an unfillable void. Sports, fame, responsibility, family, all inadvertently became layers of deception, delaying the confrontation with himself. As time passed, life led her through many different roles: athlete, husband, father, and a figure who dominated global media attention through Keeping Up with the Kardashians. But the more she lived in the public eye, the more apparent the gap between her outward image and her inner self became. And then, at age 65, when many thought the story was over, Caitlyn Jenner chose to start over. Not to become someone else, but to finally live true to the person who had always existed within her. Her appearance on the cover of Vanity Fair in 2015 was not just a media event, but a turning point. From silence to speaking out, from concealment to recognition. It was a powerful affirmation that identity has no expiration date, and it's never too late to return to yourself. And looking back on that entire journey, what remains is not just the change, but a very human message. The greatest victory is not standing on the podium of glory, but daring to stand in front of a mirror and realize who you truly are. And some journeys are quiet from the start. They begin in silence, in a feeling of being different that cannot be named. And Laverne Cox is one of those who grew up in that silence. Before becoming a familiar face on screen and an icon of representation, she was just a child trying to understand herself in a world that was always quick to label others. Her difference wasn't something she chose, but it was something she had to learn to confront very early on, amidst confused reactions, teasing, and the feeling of being outside her own life. But instead of disappearing into self-isolation, Laverne found something that allowed her to breathe. Movement. Dance didn't ask her who she was, didn't demand explanations. It simply gave her space to be fully present in her body and emotions, something the outside world wasn't ready to give her at the time. Then New York appeared as a turning point. It wasn't a miracle, but rather an environment large enough for her to try living differently, to step outside the old boundaries that had surrounded her for so long. And it was in that journey that acting became a gateway for her to be seen in a completely new way. Not as a special case, but as a person with her own story. Her role in Orange is the New Black was more than just a role. It was like a mirror reflecting many real-life lives, people rarely seen fully on screen. And from there, Laverne not only told her own story, but also opened up space for many other stories to exist. But looking deeper, what makes her journey memorable isn't fame. It's how she transformed what once pushed her to the margins into strength to step into the center of social dialogue, about presence, recognition, and the right to live authentically. And perhaps the biggest lesson from that journey is simple. Sometimes, strength doesn't come from always knowing who you are, but from keeping moving forward, even when the world doesn't yet understand you. In the world of elite sports, where everything is often measured by strength, victory, and numbers, Fallon Fox's story creates a haunting dissonance, where the question of identity sometimes weighs more heavily than the outcome of a match. And when she stepped into the octagon, it wasn't just a fighter stepping out to compete, but a human being entering the center of an endless debate. From her early years, Fallon lived with the feeling that she didn't fully belong to the form the world saw. That difference didn't erupt immediately, but quietly accumulated over the years, in moments of silence, in isolation, and in the constant need to explain her own existence. The decision to transition, therefore, was not just a personal choice, but a step that came at the cost of public attention, prejudice, and harsh judgment. Entering professional MMA as one of the first openly transgender fighters, Fallon faced not only opponents in the cage, but also a massive public arena. To some, she was a symbol of courage and pioneering spirit. To others, she became the focal point of debate about the boundaries between equality and difference. But regardless of which side of the debate she stood on, one thing remained constant. She stepped into the fight. I took blows, got up, and continued. What makes Fallon's story transcend the realm of sport isn't her victory or defeat, but the fact that it forces society to question how we perceive people within systems built on categorization. In every strike, every media appearance, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She inadvertently became part of a larger dialogue about recognition, boundaries, and the right to exist authentically. And perhaps what remains after all this is not controversy, but an unavoidable truth. Sometimes the hardest battles don't take place in cages, but in the way the world chooses to define a human being. And when the story concludes, what remains is not the headlines or the debates that once arose, but the people who dared to step outside their comfort zones to live authentically. Each journey is different, but they all lead to the same point: the courage to not hide from oneself. Some walk through the spotlight, some through public pressure, some through long periods of silence. But they all choose one thing in common: not turning their backs on their true selves. And perhaps, when watching these stories, the most important thing is not to agree or disagree, but to learn to see a person with understanding instead of judgment. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. Perhaps, somewhere in these stories, you will find a part of your own thoughts. See you in the next videos, where small stories can open up very big perspectives.